to WKNX Radio's Halloween special, Michigan Mysteries, written and produced by Dennis Morrison. Music by Robert Coburg, copyright Dan Curtis Productions, 1969. Good evening, and a very happy Halloween to you. This is your host, Dennis Morrison. In the spirit of the season, tonight I'm going to tell you about some things that have happened here in Michigan that are not only a little bizarre, but also a little bit frightening. The first story I call A Problem with Gas, and just as Orson Welles horrified listeners in the 1930s with his famous War of the Worlds broadcast, the people in Michigan in 1966 thought they were being invaded by aliens for real. The weather in late winter, early spring, was unusually warm in Michigan. In fact, in February and March, it was not uncommon to have rain and fog rather than snowstorms. Something unusual was in the air. But just how unusual, nobody could even begin to realize. That is, until the unsettled month of March. Michigan, in fact, the entire northeast United States, but especially Michigan, began to be caught up in the grips of an enormous UFO flap. A flap is a period of intense UFO sightings. Now, the official sightings, though there were many that were unreported, were made by over 100 witnesses, some of those even being police officers. In fact, things got so intense that the United States Air Force, in an attempt to calm growing public fears, called in a special team to investigate the UFO sightings. Project Blue Book was the official Air Force agency for investigating UFOs, and led by astronomer J. Allen Hynek, they strove to find explanations, which, by the way, turned out to be as strange as the sightings themselves. It all began on March 17, 1966, in the lower part of the state. Milan police officers reported seeing a red object hurtle low over the community. The UFO raced across the pre-dawn skies east towards Saline. Washtenaw County Deputy Sheriff David G. Fitzpatrick and Sergeant Noel K. Schneider had been sent to the scene of a traffic accident on US 12, which was 3 miles west of Saline. The dispatcher wired them a warning. Both officers saw the moon, and next to it, a triangular object. Its point was up, and it moved across the moon and then just hovered there. Of all the objects in the clear night sky, the triangle was the brightest. Then 2 more such triangles appeared in the sky. A real emergency was indeed in progress. The Milan dispatcher's voice came over the radio. Many reliable sources were reporting the object from a town whose population was only 2,800. The police officers took a series of back roads to Milan. The lone UFO closest to them began to move, remaining just ahead of their cruiser. The duo stopped to take photographs and were joined by 2 other officers who were watching 2 top-shaped objects etch luminous circles across the sky. A 4th object was sighted. This one, clam-shaped. At either end were blue or yellow flashing lights. A sequence of flashing red lights flowed along the object's horizontal axis where the 2 halves of the clamshell would meet. Finally, at 6:45 a.m., the UFOs were gone, and the first sighting was over. Only 3 days later, on March 20th, the residents of Michigan tumbled out of the frying pan and directly into the fire. March 20th was a Sunday. The Manor family lived in a nice 2-story farmhouse on the Guinness Road in Dexter, Michigan. The house was separated from a 300-acre swamp by a hollow and a creek. That evening, the family was gathered there for dinner. As the family was eating, the dogs outside began to howl, and Frank Manor, the father, went outside to see if he could calm them down, but they were in a frenzy of excitement. A ball of fire darted across the sky. The UFO stopped in midair just above a cluster of trees in the swamp. At either end of the fiery ball of lights were flickering. The object fell behind the trees with a strange red glow marking the spot. The Manor family observed a faint glow coming from the swamp, and the area surrounding the object looked as though it were painted red. Frank and his son Ronnie made their way through the mire of the swamp. They could hardly see where they were stepping, but ahead, a flickering glow silhouetted a knoll. About 500 yards ahead of them, at eye level, a football-shaped object the size of a car glowed in the darkness. The object alternated its colors from gray one moment, then blue-brown the next. One report stated that the object seemed to rest on a cushion of haze about 8 feet above the mud. In the center of the object shone what looked like a bright headlight, and at one tip a light rotated red and white. At the other end, a blue-green light glimmered. The metal the craft was made of appeared to be quilted. Ronnie shouted something to his dad, and almost as if on command, the lights went out. When they ran to the spot where the object had been, it was gone. The Dexter police arrived at the farmhouse around 7:45 p.m. that evening. They, along with Frank and Ronnie, watched the lights flicker near the trees. The object rose from the swamp some 1,000 feet and then wandered off through the sky in a manner that made Sheriff Honeywell feel that it might be lost. 3 similar UFOs swooped down on the lost entity, then all formed a quarter circle and dashed off towards the west, gaining altitude. Now I remind you, friends and listeners of WKNX, the events I am telling you about are not works of fiction, but actually took place here in Michigan in 1966. On the 21st, there was a hub of activity. Air Force officers were arriving in Ann Arbor to investigate the sightings. At the same time, the Pentagon was telling reporters that no one had been sent to Ann Arbor and that the Air Force wasn't investigating the sightings as they had no knowledge of them at all. Then who were the officers that arrived on the scene? The 21st of March was not a good day for the Air Force or for Michigan. It was a rainy and very stormy night at Hillsdale College, located some 50 miles from Ann Arbor. And on that memorable night, some 87 people consumed the better part of 5 hours watching a disc-shaped object from behind the fragile safety of their windows. From the girls' dormitory, the rotating beacon light from Hillsdale County Airport could be seen slicing dim paths through the clouds. From the second story of the dorm, the Slayton Arboretum was partially visible. By about 10:30 that night, the rain had stopped. As the clouds cleared, a red light could be seen in the sky. The object moved in a very erratic manner. First it streaked to the right, and then to the left. It also changed colors, going from red to white, and it's said to have delved headlong and to have bounced like a rubber ball at the end of a string. The light turned white again and then came down on a course which would, if it had held, cause it to collide with the dorm. The object finally stopped very near the Slayton Arboretum, where it hovered and it pulsated in a misty fog. The object moved a little, about 100 feet up in the air, floating from side to side, but remained adjacent to the lagoon for the remainder of the sighting. The girls shut off the lights in the dorm and began watching and recording their observations in notebooks. Oddly, every time the light from the airport beacon came in the UFO's direction, it dimmed its lights until the beam had passed. And the police this time were having trouble sighting the object. Every time their cruiser would come within 200 feet of the lights, they would go out. The sighting lasted until 2:30 a.m. Then the lights faded, and the girls, nervously, went to bed. The Air Force wanted to discount the Michigan sightings because they were just too hard for them to deal with. On the afternoon of March 22nd, Dr. J. Allen Hynek arrived at Selfridge Air Force Base to begin his investigation for the Air Force. After days of study, Hynek held a press conference at the Detroit Press Club where he announced his conclusions. Dr. Hynek announced to an astonished and disbelieving public that all the Michigan sightings were caused by swamp gas. He said that the unusually mild winter had allowed such luminous gases to build up and make the interesting aerial display. Many years later, before his death, Dr. Hynek was quoted as having said that he always regretted making that swamp gas announcement and that the Michigan sightings were still a mystery to him. Now, the sightings were not just taking place downstate. In 1966, I lived in Bridgeport. My parents had a home on Shreve Drive off from State Street. Shreve Drive was a dead end back then, a very quiet little road. And I recall one evening sitting in the living room with my mom and dad, sister and brother, watching television. I looked out the door towards the dead end, and there floating through the sky soundlessly was a large, glowing green oval. I was so scared that I made not a move and told no one about the sighting. That is, until now. Likely, it is that we will never know just what visited the night skies in Michigan back then. It will always be a mystery to us, but then, mystery is what Halloween is all about. Now, a great deal of Halloween deals with ghosts, goblins, witches, and warlocks. And the Native Americans who inhabited Michigan so long ago had their own version of such creatures. They called them Maquamosa, or the Bear Walker. Nestled among the fragrant pines near the community of Oscoda is the Mankato Indian Reservation. And going there even today is like entering a totally different world. The homes are run down, lives are ruled by superstition, even though there has been a small Methodist church there since the mid-1800s. The Maquamosa is just such a superstition, and there's not much known about it outside of Indian circles. It is a legend which finds its roots in prehistoric times, and yet still weaves its web today. A legend, or is it? A chief of that reservation, now deceased, John Thompsons, gave me an interview about the Bear Walker, who he claimed to have encountered. The chief told me that the power of the Maquamosa is not used against white people. It is only for the Indians to settle grudges. And the chief told me that the practitioners were very sly indeed. The practitioners would pose as good Christian church members, but would do the devil's work on the side. The power comes down from ancient times and is passed from one generation to another. The power cannot be refused and must be used. They can transform themselves into various shapes, but most often it is into a ball of light. Chief Naganagan spoke with fear as he related that frequently they change themselves into the form of bears, and in that form they stalk forth to revenge the wrongs done to themselves or their kinsmen. The chief continued telling that the bear walk is connected also with brilliant lights. He said when the person transforms to the bear and walks upright through the forest in search of its victims, the beast is ablaze with brilliant lights. The chief recalled one time, watching from the barn by his house. He said he could see all the trees lit up as the bear walker passed through the woods. At the Mankato Reservation, there was a woman living who was a bear walker. I need not reveal her name. Suffice it to say, she was very ancient indeed. Her face was deeply crevassed with wrinkles, and she looked to be as old as the pine forest that surrounded her ramshackled home. One Indian man himself, now quite old, told me that he and his brother were walking through the woods one day. They saw a bear walker coming towards them in the shape of a brilliant ball of light. The two boys got sly and hid off the side of the path, and then leapt upon the devilish creature as it passed by them. The beast was spitting fire and fighting like crazy, but finally it gave up. The monster turned into the woman I just mentioned, and she begged for her release, which they granted. It has been reported that an innocent bystander can be knocked unconscious by the bear walker's sheer power as it walks by. But there is a way to protect yourself. If you see one coming through the woods, double back and take a pinch of sand from the path it has traveled over. Put the sand in your bottom lip, and the bear walk cannot hurt you. The next time you're up north, think about who or what might be coming up the path behind you. Come to think of it, could those bright lights in 1966 have been a bear walker? You just never know in the strange world that dominates the dark shadows. Everyone has heard of the Bermuda Triangle, where so many mysterious disappearances have taken place over the years. But did you know that Michigan has its own triangle? Known as the Great Lakes Triangle, it is said that more disappearances have taken place there than in the famous Bermuda Triangle. Let me tell you a little bit about it. I think you'll be fascinated. First, consider the episode of the Wyerton Belle. Colby's Bay is located on the east side of Bruce Peninsula, opening on the Georgian Bay of Lake Huron. In 1881, Roderick Cameron and his son lived near the bay at Weirton, Ontario. It happened on November 25th that they were watching the waters from the window at their home. They were anxious for the steamer Weirton Belle to come into view as another sun was to arrive on her. Roderick knew that if they watched for the steamer to come into sight, they would have plenty of time to make it to the docks before the passengers unloaded. Exactly when the Weirton Belle arrived is not recorded because its arrival was overshadowed by what happened to a small passenger steamer, the Jane Miller. It appeared that the Jane Miller was also headed for Weirton. When observed by the Weirtons, she was about a half a mile from shore. The Camerons found it odd that the Jane Miller was sitting there stationary. There was no distress signal, and she remained afloat. Oddly, a heavy cloud completely enveloped her. The cloud was so thick that the steamer could not be seen. The cloud lifted as quickly as it had come. The cloud then lifted as quickly as it had come, but the Jane Miller was gone. No explanation has ever been offered. The Jane Miller vanished forever on calm waters. The bay was searched. No trace of the ship was found. Not a single body of a crew member was recovered. Only 5 things remained as a testimony that the Jane Miller had ever been there. 5 uniform caps were found floating on the water where the ship had last been seen. Now, there was another incident at near exactly the same place, but 85 years later. Another craft vanished, this time an airplane. It was a twin-engine Piper PA-30. It made its last position report at 2:30 a.m. on March 17, 1966. Perhaps only an odd twist of fate that this episode occurred as Michigan was going through the UFO flap that I told you about earlier. Ernest Neighbors, age 48, was working for the Alpena Flying Service and had departed from Phelps Collins Airport at Alpena around 4:30 p.m. on March 16th. Neighbors was to fly to Bradley Field, Windsor Locks. The night was clear. Visibility was very good. He was scheduled to pick up 450 pounds of chemicals from Monsanto Chemical Company. The Neighbors arrived at Windsor Locks at 7:52 p.m. ahead of schedule. He unloaded the chemicals and then departed about 9:59 p.m. At 2:30 a.m., Neighbors was reported over Weirton, Ontario. The flight was proceeding smoothly. He radioed an estimated arrival back at Alpena for 3:20 a.m., and that had only been 50 minutes away. Then suddenly, there was no Neighbors. His plane vanished without a trace. The Civil Aeronautics Board reported 6 months later that despite an extensive search by both U.S. and Canadian Air-Sea Rescue Services, that nothing had been located of the airplane or the pilot. The case is still unsolved. In some cases, the bodies were not missing, and this made a few cases even more perplexing and hard for the mind to deal with. Take, for example, the case of the Charles Price. The Charles Price was just into Lake Huron and bound to Ashtabula, Ohio, on Lake Erie to Superior, Wisconsin. The Charles Price was carrying a load of soft coal that weighed 9,000 tons. In an accident of some sort, all hands were lost, and the ship floated for days. Now, the Regina was a Canadian package freighter that was 269 feet long. This ship was carrying mostly lumber. The Regina was lost without a trace. In the following weeks, bodies from the Regina, Charles Price, and James C. Carruthers all began washing ashore. The circumstances were very odd, to say the least. One of the bodies was given to William Radigan for identification. The first body given to him was a shock to him. Despite the ruthless battering of the storm, he recognized his former chief, John Groundwater. And William said, That's big good-natured John. Are you sure? The coroner asked. William replied, Sure, I'm sure. I worked under him all season. I saw him just last Saturday. I don't know. Why? What's the trouble? The coroner responded, Well, if he was the chief engineer of the Price, why was he found with a preserver marked Regina around him? Now, it may, of course, be speculated that the two boats were slammed together in the storm so that the men passed from one deck to the other, seizing any preserver that they could. But unfortunately, that theory would be inconsistent with the facts because the ships were at least 15 miles apart when they went down. And now, to me, one of the weirdest and most disconcerting episodes took place with the body of a John Thompson. Now, considering the body of John Thompson, your imagination is stretched to its limits in trying to figure out just what did happen. John Thompson had quit as crewman aboard the James Carruthers just before its fateful trip, in which all hands were lost. Mysteriously, a body strongly resembling Thompson's did wash ashore. This resemblance was nothing less than incredible. Both John Thompsons had the initials JT tattooed on their left forearms. They both had identical scars on their arms and legs, and they had the same dental irregularities. And get this, each had the same 2 deformed toes. Extraordinarily, John Thompson's father identified the body as that of his son, and this was confirmed by other family members. Yet at the wake, John Thompson walked in, shocking everyone. To this day, the mystery of the 2 John Thompsons has not been solved and remains one of the most disturbing mysteries to have taken place on the Great Lakes. Think about it. What could possibly account for 2 identical bodies that were in all essence the same man? One alive, the other dead. The speculation alone could fill several radio programs. Well, friends and listeners of WKNX Radio, I could go on for a long time because we haven't even scratched the surface of the great mysteries which abound in the lore of our Great Lakes state. Perhaps we'll have more next Halloween, but until then, I bid you again a very happy Halloween. God bless, and good night.
Of persons. For if there come unto your assembly, will bring in goodly apparel,